So the ARCS model for student motivation is pretty much kind of what it says in the tin. It's a model which is used to try and plan or guide or evaluate student motivation during or before or as part of a particular learning process. I suppose the reason I present it here with a view to assignment 2 is really because I think it's quite a useful model from the point of view of, I suppose maybe for the same reasons that some of the other models that I've covered for assignment 2 possess. It's kind of very broadly applicable, so whatever piece of TEL or even whatever kind of learning solution you're looking at, motivation is going to be a key factor, and the degree to which the learning solution fosters, encourages, promotes, supports student motivation. So it can be applied to pretty much anything, which I think makes it quite useful and makes it quite applicable for assignment 2. I suppose another element as well is that it's maybe a bit unique in that it isn't really looking to identify the effectiveness of the learning. It's not trying to measure necessarily or guide what a student learnt or how effective the course was in applying the learning. It's looking at it from a slightly different angle. So it's looking at it from the angle of motivation. So you could potentially include the ARCS model alongside a different kind of learning model, like for example Mayer or Gagne or whatever, and you can talk about two quite different things. So something might be very good at, for example, Gagne's 9 events. It might apply them very well and might follow all the required steps and do that correctly, but it could be terrible in terms of motivating students and encouraging them to take part, and that can lead to some quite interesting evaluation if you're looking at assignment 2. Or it might be very good at motivating and kind of progressing and kind of encouraging students, but it might be terrible in terms of actually applying the learning effectively. So it's useful in that it's broadly applicable, and you can put it alongside, or you can evaluate it along with whatever other kind of model you might choose to use. So there's 4 elements in ARCS: attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. I suppose it's represented as a bit of a quadrant here. I wouldn't necessarily say that kind of it is chronological, so it's not like kind of attention leads to relevance, leads to confidence, leads to satisfaction, although you could argue that. It's kind of, I don't think it's designed with that in mind, but you could certainly argue that kind of, one leads on to the next. But it doesn't have to be absolutely chronological. It's not that it absolutely has to be used 1, 2, 3, 4. There might be elements of attention, but quite poor satisfaction. So you don't have to. I'd be cautious, I guess, about making links between, well, it does attention well, so obviously relevance has to be good, so obviously confidence has to be good. So the first element is attention, and we've spoken quite a bit about this before when we talked about, for example, in cognitivism, we talked about the importance of gaining attention and how that ties into the sensory store and working memory. The first step of Gagne's 9 events of instruction is all about gaining attention. And the use of instructional cues is obviously a very kind of good and important element in terms of kind of being able to do that. So attention, obviously important to kind of get from the get-go. And ways in which you might do that, you can divide them into a couple of different kind of headings, and the ARC model kind of does this quite well. It provides a few different kind of categories in terms of each of the 4 points that it kind of covers. So a few things, the first category you might talk about is perceptual arousal. So perceptual arousal is kind of to do with people's perception of things. So if they're looking at the course, you might try and grab attention in a number of ways. So for example, you might use examples. So you might use real world examples, specific examples about what the content of the learning is going to cover. Here is a case study identifying how important instructional design is for learning experience designers nowadays, or here is an example of a piece of TEL which didn't factor in good learning experience design, and look at how terrible it turned out. Humor is a very kind of useful tool for getting people's attention. Too much humor might be distracting, Luckily, you guys never have to worry about too much humor in my lectures, but a small amount of humor can be very useful to help kind of gain interest, and that can be done any number of ways. Surprise, maybe kind of a small bit alongside that, can be kind of a useful way of getting attention as well. So, producing something which learners weren't expecting, using some element of conflict potentially, some small element of conflict, challenging kind of existing held views or their own views, some element of incongruity, so starting off maybe with something which they weren't expecting or which doesn't fit into the rest of the course or their experience. All of that goes a bit past learners' experiences, provides new kind of ways of new points of view or ways of viewing kind of something, and all of that can be very good for kind of getting attention. Inquiry arousal then is more about kind of, I suppose, questioning learners and getting them to kind of question things themselves. So if perceptual arousal is about kind of showing and grabbing their attention, inquiry arousal is a bit about kind of getting them to reflect, getting them to think based on their own experiences. Active participation might ask them to do something. So you might give them a particular task. You might give them, for example, if it was a face-to-face environment, you might give them some kind of role-playing activity. You might get them to try and do something. In an online capacity, I guess even what we do, one element which we try and do during the start of every year running the Masters, we do that icebreaker activity. Everybody has to upload something, a picture and a description of themselves to Slack or to wherever, and everybody has to get involved. Inquiry then is maybe asking learners questions, allowing them to do brainstorming, allowing them to do critical thinking, but essentially getting them to kind of ask a particular question. Again, you could do that in a similar way. Everybody has to ask one question. Everybody has to come up with a question. Everybody has to think about something and offer it forward. So that kind of element of inquiry is kind of really about questioning, learners questioning, getting them involved, getting them to do something. And variability then would be kind of essentially just using a variety of methods and approaches. So, you could, I suppose, kind of, this is something which may be beyond happening at the beginning of a course of learning or a piece of TEL. Variability is something which carries throughout. So, what can often happen is in a lot of TEL is you get people's attention at the start, but then their attention drops off quickly enough afterwards because, it's the same old stuff. It's the same old story. So variability is an important thing in terms of being able to, I suppose, sustain interest, and you would do that in maybe similar ways to kind of what we already talked about in attention. Keep asking people things, keep discussion going, keep changing things up in terms of use of media, surprising people, using humor, using examples, so on and so forth. Relevance then is the next element in terms of the ARCS model, and again there's a number of different categories here. So goal orientation is very much based around kind of identifying or tying relevance into a specific learning goal, and that might be a learning outcome or it might be something more specific to learners. So perceived present worth, if you were going to talk about something, you would maybe try and make it relevant by identifying how it'll be helpful to learners today. So if you want to be a good e-learning learning experience designer nowadays, you really do need to know about the new media workplace. It is very important to know about the new media workplace because it's an environment in which you'll have to operate. If you don't know about it, you'll fall behind, so on and so forth. Perceived future usefulness then is pretty much the same thing, but looking into the future. In the future, it is going to be very important that you know about this, you know about that. So for example, we know for a fact that even based on our current context, that the workplace environment is changing. So if you want to kind of get a job correctly, you're going to know how to work online. If you want to kind of work effectively in the workplace of the future, you are going to need to know about AI. You are going to need to know about learning analytics, so on and so forth. Motive matching then is maybe is a little bit more personal. So this is moving away from like, this is going to be very important for the industry or for your job title or for whatever. This is more maybe down to kind of the learner's own motivation. So one element of motive matching is needs matching, and that might involve, assessing learners yourself to get a better understanding of whether they learn because of achievement, power, affiliation, requirements, determination, all of these kind of things. So, needs matching is kind of maybe a bit more interactive. It's more about, or the whole area of motive matching, it's a little bit more interactive. Goal orientation, you can certainly kind of say, look, this is important now, this is important, this will be important in the future. Motive matching is maybe more of a two-step process. It's identifying potentially learners' needs and try to match what you present and what you provide based on that. Alternatively, there might be an element of choice, so you might let learners choose their own instructional method, their own learning strategies, how they go about doing something, so on and so forth. So relevance, motive matching might be important for relevance because it makes it very, very personally applicable and relevant for the learner. And then familiarity would deal with either a link to a previous experience, so you give a learner some sense of continuity or some sense of the relevance of what they're learning by helping them to establish a connection between the new information that you're providing or the new information that they're going to access and what they already know and what they already experience. So, in your job, have you ever struggled to, structure learning experiences in the right way, or have you ever had a hard time in kind of keeping up to date with what kind of new workplace environments are kind of important or relevant? Modeling then is showing learners role models, essentially. So you try and make it relevant to them by kind of showing them, for example, here is Europe's top learning experience designer, and here is all the elements that this course will contain, which will kind of help you kind of work at their level. So modeling is kind of essentially just kind of making it relevant by showing them role models that they might want to kind of look up to or work with or kind of emulate, and how the learning is kind of relevant in that, from that point of view. Confidence then is obviously very much the process of building learner confidence. So building learner confidence is important and it's often overlooked in learning, but it is hard to balance. And confidence really comes down to a process of challenge, activity, and feedback. So it's a question of trying to instill in learners that they, not unjustifiably know the material, that they have accomplished learning, that this learning benefits them, and that they should be proud and confident in their knowledge of the learning. But it can be hard to balance because you want to allow learners to succeed, but provide a relevant level of challenge. And also you don't want to kind of give, in digital badges terms, they're called warm body badges. It just means it's kind of participation trophies. Everybody gets something just for showing up. Learners should feel that their success is as a result of the genuine effort that they've put forth. So it's not enough to just kind of say everybody gets an A. I was reading about something recently called the IKEA effect, which is, IKEA could just ship the furniture to you, but people tend to have a bigger attachment to their desk or to whatever they put together when it's something they've put together themselves. So it's a similar notion here. You can kind of you can be effective in engaging learners and helping them to achieve their learning if they get the sense that they're just that it's all the one, whether they try or they don't. They're not going to have much confidence in the learning or potentially even in themselves as learners. So confidence really is an element of balance. And that, as identified there, it's a challenge in a face-to-face environment. An online delivery then introduces additional challenges and whole new elements that you got to think about as well. So that's just maybe a bit of a precursor to the whole area of confidence. Ways in which, or categories, according to the ARCS model, that you might be considering for this. One thing is learning requirements. So, I suppose like we've talked about with learning outcomes and kind of, a lot of what we spoke about in behaviorism, big element here is just providing learners with kind of, learning outcomes, learning objectives, prerequisites, standards, and kind of criteria that they can use themselves to establish positive expectations. So, by the time you finish this course, you will be able to apply a variety of instructional design strategies and models and methods. So, that's in the kind of module descriptor. That is one of the learning outcomes for the module descriptor. So, if you finish this and you feel you are able to do that, then that will kind of have the effect of instilling confidence in you around it. Success opportunities then are maybe elements which are a bit more personal to the learner. So one success opportunity would be facilitating self-growth. So you give learners the opportunity to be successful by providing them with experiences, giving them a feeling that they have achieved, that they've grown, that they have developed as a result of engaging with the learning. And ways you would do that is, by kind of identifying the kind of requirements for these activities and these opportunities which they take part in. And another big thing then is providing feedback. So giving them feedback about their improvements, also giving them feedback about their deficiencies so they can adjust their performance. But providing feedback is a key element of instilling them with confidence. And I suppose that in itself can be a challenge too, because if someone maybe isn't achieving, it's important to be honest, but to also give positive feedback in a way that doesn't discourage them. So feedback should always be, if not positive, focused on a positive result. And a piece of TL which basically said that's wrong, you're shit, isn't really going to do that very well. So if you were looking to kind of measure the degree to which a piece of TL facilitates confidence, you would look to kind of what it tells learners they will be able to do, and the feedback that it gives them around same. And personal control then is essentially just that. It's giving learners control. So if a learner has control over the learning process, if they can feel that their success is not totally dependent on external factors and that there's internal factors affecting their success, that is a very effective way of giving them confidence. And I suppose one thing which we should bear in mind is that not every single one of these different categories are going to be achievable. Sometimes they might be somewhat mutually exclusive. So it's not that kind of a piece of TL has to have learning requirements and success opportunities and personal control. What is important is that for each of the different kind of 4 items in the ARCS model, that it does achieve in whatever way it chooses, that the piece of TL does have the effect of getting attention, making stuff relevant to the learner, inspiring confidence in them. And then finally, satisfaction. So if learners feel good about learning results, they'll be motivated to learn. So ways in which one might kind of go about doing this is providing opportunities to use newly acquired knowledge and skills. And we can see in the Kolb model, that's kind of the Kolb's learning cycle. That's kind of the last step, giving them the ability and the opportunity to go off and apply what they've learned themselves in the real world, and providing feedback and reinforcements around that. But again, like with the confidence element, you have to be wary of overdoing it. So don't over-reward simple behavior. Don't give warm baddie badges. Avoid making negative consequences entertaining, particularly for asynchronous pieces of TEL. If there's this gigantic song and dance and kind of hilarious element that happens when they get something wrong, that will encourage, particularly I guess younger kids, that will encourage them to fail in the learning, in the game, in the whatever. They will, they'll fail on purpose because that's a more entertaining option. And avoid too many extrinsic rewards. So if you're constantly giving a kid sweets for doing something, then they're not really going to be doing it for the joy of doing it or for kind of the benefit of doing the activity themselves. They'll be doing it for the sweets. Similarly with learners, you don't want to have too many extrinsic rewards. I would be of the opinion you do need some, particularly if you're talking about professional development, but you do want to try and ideally motivate them to learn off their own bat as well. And remember that satisfaction is closely related to confidence. So, if you are instilling confidence in learners, then they will get more satisfaction out of it. If you're not instilling confidence in learners, it's not going to be a very satisfying process for them. And so if you are looking to kind of provide satisfaction, ways in which you might do this, or categories in which you might do this: intrinsic reinforcement, so internal motivation, learners have fun, learners engage with it, learners have confidence, learners are happy with it, and they recognize it as kind of a beneficial process, as a self-rewarding process, they'll continue learning without reward, without external motivational elements. Extrinsic rewards then, positive feedback, rewards, reinforcements, here's a day off, here's an extra day to submit, things like that. So extrinsic rewards, I would say, are important, particularly if you really are trying to motivate people and trying to kind of give them some sense of satisfaction out of what they've achieved. And it's suggested as well that you provide reinforcement at non-predictable intervals. So, that kind of, it's not every single session, every single week, every single page, that it kind of happens intermittently, I suppose, as a way of keeping learners on their toes a bit. And equity as well, which is maintaining standards, consistent standards and consequences. So ways you might do this, I suppose, it's important to make sure that everybody's getting the same learning experience, that everybody's getting marked the same way, that everyone gets the same feedback, so on and so forth. So ways in which you might do this, I suppose you see a lot of them in this master's already, assessment rubrics, marking schemes, this is the brief, everybody follows the brief, just creates this kind of sense that kind of, if I do well, it is because, if I do well compared to my fellow learners even, it is because, I have achieved. It's not because the teacher likes me better, it's not because I'm more popular, it's because I have excelled based on the rules which were in place, based on what was asked of me. So the ARCS model, like I said, is useful, I think, because it's very broadly applicable. It's applicable to nearly everything, and it does come at it from that different angle. It's not coming at it in terms of effectiveness, it's coming at it in terms of to what degree does it motivate learners and motivate learning. And you can see, I think, a lot of the elements we covered under cognitivism when we talk about the ARC model. Again, there's nothing particularly new there. It doesn't it's not suggesting anything that one does anything particularly different in developing a piece of TEL. It's just maybe looking at, to what degree does it use these different elements, these instructional cues, feedback, motivation. To what degree does it use these things in order to motivate learners? So I suppose one other element which another perspective you can maybe use the ARCS model for is it looks at learners kind of coming out the other end. So it's not just encouraging the students at the start, but it's maybe during, it's a bit cumulative. It's kind of, you can get a good sense of the ARCS model at the end of the course. So kind of if you go through a piece of TEL, you can look at the ARCS model during, but you can also look at it afterwards. So by the time you're finished, did it keep attention? Did it make stuff relevant? Did it instill confidence? Did it instill satisfaction? So you can apply it that way as well. You might kind of talk about, well, within this piece of TL, does it follow Mayer principles? Does it follow Gagnet's 9 events of instruction? And you can apply ARCS during the piece of TL as well. But it is maybe worth looking at it kind of by the time you're finished the piece of TL, to what degree did it effectively utilize the ARCS model.